Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back, as is Tim Matthews. We're talking all about Stand By Me today. And this movie came out in 1986. It was directed by Rob Reiner and stars quite the group of kids. You have Will Wheaton, River Phoenix, Corey Feldman, Jerry O'Connell, Kiefer Sutherland, John Cusack makes an appearance. There's just so much going on here. But Tim, are you excited to talk about this today?
Oh, absolutely. And shout out to River Phoenix. Apparently, today is also the 30th anniversary of The Last Crusade, where he played the young Indiana Jones.
Yeah, so we have quite a bit to talk about because this cast is just crazy. So why don't we go ahead and start there? Obviously, you mentioned River Phoenix, and unfortunately, he died of an overdose in 1993, I believe. So not
Something like
too
that.
terribly long after this. And I actually had a featurette in the special features section of the DVD copy that I have. And, a lot of the kids were probably, I would say, like late teens, early 20s when they filmed it. And he was obviously absent from that because he was only 23, I believe, when he passed. So you have this great actor who unfortunately didn't get to star in a lot more great roles. And I think that's something we definitely would have expected from him given just the stature of his family in the acting world, especially his brother Joaquin. But they've really captured the essence of all of these characters with their casting. And I think that's one of the main reasons why this movie works so well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know the casting was incredible. And it's I mean, the amount of times you watch a movie that has kids in it and you can sit there and you can say, "All right, well, the kids they did a good enough job for what they had to do." But I mean, the this was definitely a who's who, and another level of kid actors. And then of course you mentioned John Cusack. Every time I watch this movie, I always forget that John Cusack's in it until that scene. I'm like, oh my god, it's John Cusack. And then the other one that always surprises me that I forget is when the narration starts in the beginning. You've got Richard Dreyfuss, and the second he starts talking, I'm like, oh my god, Richard Dreyfuss.
Yeah, exactly. And I totally didn't realize until the first time I had watched this movie that Kiefer Sutherland was like sort of the bad boy actor when he was in his
Yeah,
teens, early 20s. And,
yeah.
I'm so familiar with him from lately Designated Survivor. And I haven't watched 24, but it's on my list to get to. And I know that's sort of one of the main roles that he's known for, at least on television. So to see him in this role, I was like, wow, this is so different from what I was expecting from
Oh
the
yeah,
actor.
yeah. 24 is great, but it is like it's like he had like two careers, like because you look at this, you look at Lost Boys, even Young Guns, and then you look at Jack Bauer and Designated Survivor, and it's a whole other thing.
Yeah, he's definitely done some growing up in his roles over the years. And I think that's something that's also nice to see. And Jerry O'Connell might have been the least recognizable in a sense because, these kids sort of look relatively the same today, at least as far as Will Wheaton goes and Corey Feldman. Corey Feldman was instantly recognizable, even though I'm not sure he's done too many other big roles outside of this. I'm just not as familiar with his acting career. And Will Wheaton, he looks a lot different now because he has a bushy beard and everything, but
Yeah.
you could still kind of tell it was him. But then Jerry O'Connell, you're just like, oh, he is the kid who isn't skinny in the group. And that sort of just surprised me again the first time I saw this because I was like, wow, he definitely grew up and changed his look over the years. And, that's obviously not a bad thing. And it just amazed me how well this group of kids worked together, considering how young they were. Like you've said, with child actors, it's very, very hit or miss. Not everyone can be like the Fanning sisters, for instance, and,
Yeah.
just totally kill it in pretty much every role they are given. And it's nice to see that even though this movie was big for all of them, it didn't necessarily end up defining all of them. Like you said, River played a young Indiana Jones, and this is again directed by Rob Reiner, who has also appeared in various shows and movies. I most recently remember him from being in New Girl. So I was just like, oh, this dude directed that. And to sort of just have all of these familiar faces and names attached to this project, it's like, yeah, I really see why this movie resonated with people. But why don't we go ahead and talk a little bit about the story? The first thing I want to note, though, is that this is based off of a novella called The Body. And I really feel like they only changed the name to this movie because they closed it out by playing the song Stand By Me. So,
Probably,
you
probably.
know, The Body definitely makes sense as a title, but at the same time, Stand By Me does too, given the lyrical content of the song and everything like that. So, it wasn't something that bothered me too much, but for people who don't pay attention to the opening credits, I think some people even today might be unaware that this is a Stephen King adaptation because it's so not what you typically think of right away when you think of Stephen King. More people probably think of, Carrie, The Shining, Pet Sematary, stories like that have been done more than once over the years as far as adaptations go.
Yeah, I definitely think for Stephen King, um, for the majority of people, it's probably yeah, Stephen King's great. He does all those horror movies and everything in the horror books. But then there's ones like this, The Green Mile and Shawshank Redemption, that there's no supernatural aspect to it. There's no horror to, well, I mean, I guess prison horror, but but I feel like unless people go in knowing that it's a Stephen King adaptation, or like you said, pay attention to the credits, definitely uh, doesn't stand out as one that would be an obvious adaptation.
Yeah, I just really liked reading the story too because it was one of those things where the different seasons collection isn't necessarily your typical Stephen King stories. And at the same time, that collection had a general theme running throughout it where you have these sort of in depth looks at these different characters. You have Rita Hayworth in the Shawshank Redemption, where you get a deep dive on what prison life is like. You get The Body, where you really get to understand what it's like for these kids and teenagers in this small town, especially because the teenagers probably really want to get out of there. And I'm sure the younger kids do too, as well. And, Apt Pupil is just a whole other story. And I have not seen that adaptation yet, but I'm looking forward to it. And even Breathing Method, you just get this in depth look at a bunch of different types of people throughout those four stories. And I think those are things that definitely translate well onto the screen. And, like I said, I haven't seen Apt Pupil, so I can't speak to that one. And I know The Breathing Method has an adaptation on the way, but Shawshank and Stand By Me as far as adaptations go, are kind of top tier. And it's just great to see people taking all kinds of Stephen King stories and wanting to see them on the big screen.
Absolutely. Yeah, I actually I haven't gotten to different seasons yet. You mentioning that you had read it, I was curious how, the short story of The Body might compare to the film.
They did change a few things for the story as far as I can remember. This takes place in Castle Rock, but they're saying Castle Rock is in Oregon in the movie, which anyone who has read Stephen King knows that a good majority of his stories take place in Maine.
Right.
So, that is one of the differences there. But really, I think the core of the story remained the same. And I don't know if it's just because I've only read the story once and I've watched the movie twice now that maybe things are kind of blurring together. But really, the big difference that I recall was the setting. And that's probably for a variety of reasons. You could not get the permits you need in one state and be able to get them in another, or it's cheaper to
Right.
film in another. But I mean, I can't imagine Maine would be that expensive, or maybe they just didn't want to deal with the weather in Maine. I don't know.
Possible.
But,
Yeah.
I think that right there is the main difference. And, there is this boy's body who they find, how Vern finds out about that is the same from the story. And you really get a feel for their personalities. And that is something that Rob Reiner was able to have shine through with the cast that he basically was able to get for this movie, because they had him in the special featurette too, talking about how he had to find boys who had personalities as close to these characters as possible, because they're so young that you can't really take a chance on them having complete opposite personalities of the characters they're going to play and have that really shine through the way that it did.
Yeah, I can imagine, and it's interesting. Like, when I was reading, some fun facts about the movie, it talks about how you know all of them as kids, like they they got along just as friends, like in the movie, and hanging out and getting into to mischief, in the hotel they were staying in. They were like throwing poolside furniture into the pool. Will Wheaton was apparently like fixing video games in the lobby so that they could play them for free instead of instead of paying for them, and messing with Kiefer Sutherland. And so it's reading that, it's so clear, like the chemistry that comes across of them in the film is, not only them doing a great job as actors, but it's clear like they all liked each other, like on set. And that definitely comes through in the characters in a great way.
Yeah, it was actually pretty interesting to listen to that featurette and just what all of them had to say. I unfortunately didn't get to watch all of it because the DVD started like doing weird stuff where it was like skipping and it was just unbearable, but I got through at least a few minutes of it. And you know, like I said, the kids were more grown up by that point. So they had sort of this hindsight on filming the movie and everything that went into those performances. And you could really tell that personality wise, not a lot of things had changed for the younger group of characters. But, obviously, I would hope anyway, Kiefer Sutherland is nothing like his character in this movie. So I think they just did a very nice job of, finding these younger, not as experienced actors and having them really just embrace the characters from the story. And then you have, your John Cusack and Kiefer Sutherlands who had some experience at this point, and you could kind of get them to play characters that maybe they didn't always play. And John Cusack, he was in it for what, maybe a few minutes. I mean, his part wasn't very big because he was playing a dead character essentially. So he was sort of just in these little flashback moments that really let you understand what his relationship was like with his brother, who was Gordy, played by Will Wheaton. So, Dennis wasn't around to really guide Gordy through things anymore. And you could tell during the movie, too, that Chris kind of took over that role and he kept encouraging Gordy to write, which is something Dennis had done, which we saw in the flashbacks, because, Dennis was the high school football star or whatever, and everyone paid more attention to him. So Gordy was sort of the brother who was always left in his shadow, but Dennis seemed to really care about him. So you
Yeah.
had that relationship that obviously could never be replaced, but Chris wanted to just make his friend go for his dreams basically, and we see that eventually that does happen for him because Richard Dreyfuss is playing an older Gordy, and he is indeed a writer, and his house seems pretty dang nice.
Yeah, definitely. You see, like at the dinner table, like he and his brother, and his dad just keeps wanting to talk about football, and he keeps saying, he's like, ask Gordy about like his story. He it was really great, and the dad, yeah, kind of scoffs it off, um, and then later when they're out looking for the body, um, and they have that conversation where he's telling Gordy, you need to make sure that in school you don't get held down by us losers. We can't drag you down. You're gonna do great things. And Gordy kind of, he's still reeling from the death of his brother and the fact that his father clearly treats him like dirt. He's just like, I don't want to do those things, and he's shying away from his from what his dream is, because it's he's been put down about it so much. Even the store clerk asks him, he's like, you ever play football? And he's like, no, I don't play football. And then the guy just starts talking about his brother. So it's clear like that his brother was a big deal in Castle Rock.
Sometimes it seems like small towns really thrive on the few things they have. So if, a high school team has a really good chance at, going to the playoffs and state games and stuff like that, especially I feel like with football, it's one of those things where small towns really just seem to revolve around, these high school football teams. And I think it's something we see a lot more in, Texas with something like Friday Night Lights and stories like that, because in Texas, football is huge, especially high school and college football. They take their football very seriously, but, you know, small towns, everyone kind of knows everyone. And it's like you have to just sort of embrace what the town has going for it any given year. So if that's, the high school football team or, pie eating contest, I have no idea. It seems like they just really rally around those people and those events. And for better or worse, that's sort of the hill that they live and die on. And that really seemed to be the case, especially with Dennis. He was lifted up because of his ability to play the sport, and because Gordy didn't like football, nobody really cared what Gordy was doing. And it's sad to see, but at the same time, I feel like it's something that we've seen in a lot of different stories, but because of Dennis's death, it took on a different form in this movie. And you could tell in one of the flashbacks that Gordy's mom wasn't really paying all that much attention to him, and he went to go ask for his canteen, and she just completely ignored him because it was in the brother's room. And it's like she couldn't bring herself to even mention the brother or bother to answer Gordy's question because she would have had to say his name. So
Yeah.
it was just one of those things where you really feel for these characters, even if you can't necessarily completely relate to them. I grew up in Orange County, California. It's not small town vibes over here. So, that's not really something I could relate to, but you have these friendships that are building between these four characters throughout. And obviously they're friends before, but I think them going on this journey together just really solidifies that, even though, what they go through is relatively traumatic. They're on the hunt for a dead body, and they nearly get run over by a train. At least two of them nearly get run over by a train. And then they have to face the older boys, and, two of them run away. And then Gordy pulls out the gun and just shoots it up in the air. And, he's able to take care of business that way. But it's really just about this sense of belonging and friendship. And one of the other things I loved about this story was that they didn't feel the need to drag it out. A novella is a pretty good length when you're thinking about adapting something into a movie, because this movie was about an hour and a half. And, Shawshank was, I want to say, like a 3 hour movie, pretty much. And I think, that story lent itself to having some longer scenes just because of the setting and everything like that. But because these kids are on this journey, it's like, okay, we can only see them walking in silence for so long before something needs to happen. So
Right.
it's a challenge that I think benefits from the shorter runtime.
Definitely. Yeah, that with like this movie it moves swiftly. They introduce our characters. We're able to get to know them pretty quickly, and then they're hanging out, and one of them is like, oh, I heard this thing because my brother, I was under the deck, and pretty early on it's boom, it's like we got to go find the dead body. And it's really interesting to watch as they go on this journey that first it's we're going on this adventure, and it starts off, they all have that like Goonies excitement about it and everything, but you can see it gradually, like as they're going, and not even just seeing it subtly, they talk about it, that maybe this shouldn't be fun, maybe this shouldn't be exciting, we're going to find a dead kid. It's already starting to resonate with them, what they've set out to do, before they even get there. And as they're going along, they're having fun, and they're telling stories, and making inappropriate jokes, and climbing over fences into the junkyard areas that they're not supposed to be. You see this growth of them, that they're on the cusp of going to junior high. It's that next step in their lives that to them feels like this huge step towards adulthood, that is just we're not kids anymore. And then when it does finally come time to them finding the body, and having to deal with that, having to deal with this reality. And of course Gordy's dealing with this additional trauma of why did his brother have to die.
Yeah.
And apparently the kids weren't allowed to see Ray Bauer. They weren't allowed to see the actor until they unveil him on camera, and it was an attempt to just unsettle them and gain like the best like reaction possible. And I don't know if that's 100% true, or if it's just one of those fun little fact things. But if it is, I think it worked, because I think their reactions did feel very natural, and that's something that I think that this movie really benefits from. It's obvious that it's not a super modern movie,
Right.
but there is something timeless about it. It doesn't have things in it that make me think, oh, this is dated. It just feels of its time, and you just kind of get lost in it. And I think the movies that do feel timeless are the ones that they just pull you into that world, and you're not sitting there thinking, oh man, like look at that technology or anything. I didn't even kind of notice that. They're driving old cars and playing the mailbox baseball and everything, and you're just lost in all these moments with these characters that just feel so real. And the stuff that they're saying, maybe not so much appropriate in modern times, but it feels natural to the characters of that time, and you just get lost in it. And I think it's why this movie is still so rewatchable beyond a nostalgic standpoint, and is still held at such a high regard.
Honestly, I would say the one moment that doesn't age too well is when everyone is like throwing up at the pie eating contest,
Yeah,
because you can
you
clearly
can
tell
tell.
there's just
You
like
can
a
tell.
hose of
Yeah,
stuff just like coming from the side of them, because it's like they didn't even try to make it look that realistic. It was
yeah,
just like these giant amounts of just stuff being sprayed. And
yeah. You could tell there's like they're holding like the hose or whatever, but behind their face, and it
yeah.
doesn't always line up to their mouth. And yeah,
Yeah. I would say, that is what didn't age
yeah,
so well.
yeah,
And because there aren't too many effects really in this, you just have these kids taking this journey, and you don't really have to CGI anything to where you would be able to tell, like, oh, this is 80s CGI,
Right.
and
Yeah.
sometimes you get that in certain movies. I just recently talked about Maximum Overdrive, and you can definitely get some 80s CGI out of that movie,
There's a
especially
lot
in,
80s in that movie.
well, yeah, yeah, it was something we discussed. But I really like those movies that don't rely on the technology of the time, aside from, the cameras. This isn't going
Right.
to be, crystal clear HD or anything like that. But at the same time, I feel like that would ruin the experience of watching this movie. Even if they do, like a 4K remake or something, I'm not expecting it to be this bright, fantastic looking movie. It's still sort of drab in its color palette
Yeah.
because it's supposed to be hot and these kids are dirty, and you really aren't getting these bright colors anywhere on the screen, and that wouldn't flow with the story anyway. So I just really like how they handled pretty much everything other than the pie eating contest.
Yeah.
I would say that scene is probably the most over the top. And, Gordy is telling a story.
Yeah, because he's telling the story, so it's like anything that does like feel super outrageous and over the top, it works for it. And it's funny when he starts telling that story because he sits there and they're like, tell us one of your stories, tell us one of your stories, and of course Vern is just like, but not one of your scary ones. And so it's like a fun little nod of it being a Stephen King thing, that it's like, no, like tell me one of your nice stories, not your scary ones. And then of course, like, the ending being that his revenge was getting everyone in the town to just throw up on each other, and then it cuts back to all these young boys just going nuts over the ending, that they're just like, oh, that was awesome, what an awesome story. Because it's just like, of course, it's just big, gross ridiculousness it's a total win for them. It doesn't matter. And like you were talking about the filming, I'm very, very excited to see, how that 4K remaster comes out. And I agree with you. I think it's gonna do the film justice. I think it'll like clean it and freshen it, but I think it'll still feel very natural to the movie, because the movie, the way it's filmed, it has this real storybook vibe. It has a novella vibe to it. It's the way that perfect soundtrack comes in and just shows them, walking along the train tracks, or when it's far away and they're almost kind of silhouetted with the lake behind them. It's just this great, kid's journey in the summer, that it's just, this is the end of the summer, this is the last thing all of us might do together. And it's the simple way that it's filmed really lends it to that, because it lets us just sit with these characters and get to know them, and that really shines.
Yeah, let's talk about the end of the movie here, because
Yeah.
really there are no winners in the end. You have Richard Dreyfuss giving this narration at the end of sort of where these boys' lives went, and it didn't end so well for all of them.
I always forget how sad the ending is.
Yeah, and I totally forgot about that when I was rewatching it. I was like, "Oh man, this is bleak." And Chris ends up dying, and it really feels like Gordy is the only one who sort of makes it out and is able to accomplish his dreams, basically.
And that's what Chris, he has that conversation with Gordy. He has that conversation that it's like, you're meant to do greater things and move beyond us. And Gordy as a kid doesn't want to believe that, but as he grows up, realizes that he'll always cherish these memories and these times with his friends. As he writes, I never had any friends like I did when I was 12. But he still went on to, it looks like he has a pretty great life. It looks like he's a successful writer. Looks like he's got a nice family. They want to go play with him outside. So
And the sad thing was, Chris ended up becoming a lawyer. So he was
Right.
still able to make something of himself. Teddy ended up going to jail, he thinks, and Vern sort of just had this, I guess, middle class life, which isn't anything to really,
Right.
you know, stick your nose up at or anything. But you could tell that there was just this nostalgia at the end with that narration, especially with that last line that you mentioned that he types up on the very old computer screen. That is the one time we get like how old the
Yeah.
technology is in
Yeah.
this movie, and it's pretty funny, but it isn't so much of it to where it takes you out of the story that's being told or anything like that. And I really think that ending just really sums things up. And I can't honestly recall if that's exactly how the novella ends. I feel like there is some sort of, and this is what happened after we went our separate ways sort of thing, but please don't quote me on that. I have been reading a lot of Stephen King lately, so, it's hard to keep everything straight in my head, but that's, why a Stephen King wiki exists. I just think that this story really did a nice job of summing up who each of these kids ultimately were and who they wanted to be. And that comes through in the narration at the end. We don't need to see older versions of all of these kids, just having Gordy grow up and be the narrator, which is how they have it in the story too. That much I do remember. Gordy is looking back on his life, telling this story, and you're getting everything from his perspective. It's just a really nice way to wrap things up, even though it's very sad at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, and the entire movie, I feel like, primes you to be able to accept and resonate with an ending like that, because the whole movie isn't this grand, fun, crazy summer adventure. The fact that it is pretty somber through a lot of the movie, that it's just, they're having kid conversations, but they're also having serious life conversations. And, they're out in the woods and they're second guessing themselves. It's, I think, so I think by the time we get to the end, and even I like that, I like when that in this story, when they get to finding the body, it's the adventure's gone. The adventure's over. It's not, it's not let's get him back to the town. Like, I like that they say that, let's get a stretcher, and that their plan is to bring him back to town. But I like, after the, very intense interaction with Kiefer Sutherland's character, and they get him to go off and everything, that, their decision is, you're not taking him, we're not taking him. It's not right. It's not right that this kid had to die here. And they just make that, I think they make an anonymous call, and then the authorities find the body, and they go back to the town, and they just separate. They just go off. It's, I'll see you at school. And so I think it naturally flows to get to this great ending that is just, this is our life. This is real. It doesn't feel sensationalized. It feels very natural, and it feels realistic and sad and somber, but it's life. And the movie, it feels very poignant with that.
Yeah, one other thing I want to discuss quickly before we wrap up with some box office numbers and then final thoughts on the movie is the soundtrack, because there are tons
So
of
good.
50s and 60s songs that really stand out. And I think maybe one of the best needle drops in this movie is when they start playing Lollipop by the Chordettes, because
Yes.
I would not have been able to tell you who sang that song, but you can bet I knew the words to that song. So it was just one of those iconic songs, and it just kind of fit the vibe of the characters, and the time period. Because even if you grow up in, say the 80s or something, typically you're exposed to your parents' music, which is coming an entire generation before yours. So, you'll be in tune with those 50s and 60s songs and everything. So it just really felt nice to hear those songs, even though it was a movie that came out in the 80s. They didn't feel the need to, shoehorn the 80s into this movie because, if I'm not mistaken, they don't really give a time period for this, but you can tell, the 50s and 60s are still sort of lingering in this small town just based on the cars they use, how they're dressed, and things like that. So, it might not even take place in the 80s, but because it came out in the 80s, it's like, okay, not everything needs to have some 80s influence in it. And I
Yeah.
think that was very refreshing. I was like, oh, yes, actual oldies music.
Yeah, I love the soundtrack so much, and I mean, yeah, like I like growing up because of my parents. I was growing up on all the songs from this soundtrack, all the songs from The Sandlot, the Beach Boys, the Beatles, everything like that. And I love that you bring up Lollipop. That it's like not only does it's so perfect in that scene, but I love how it matches up with the way they're singing along, and then they do the little like pop sound with their mouth, and
Yeah.
it's just perfect. Like that part makes me laugh every time, and I love it. There's so many fantastic charming moments in this movie that you can't help but just love and enjoy. And the soundtrack definitely helps because the soundtrack's just great.
Yeah, it really is. Going into the box office numbers, though, this movie was budgeted at $8 million and it ended up making just over $52 million. So for a movie like this, $8 million to the average Joe like you and I is a lot of money, but in Hollywood, that's pretty much next to nothing. There are certain kinds of movies that are still being made for that kind of movie, but for the
Blumhouse.
most part, I don't think a lot of those movies are necessarily as good as something like Stand By Me. And I think a lot of that just has to do with the time period when this was made and who they were able to have in it. Kids typically don't command these large salaries like a lot of stars do today. And you could still make a movie for $8 million today, don't get me wrong, but, you know, I don't think it'll be quite as noteworthy as this. And I know things like A Quiet Place were sort of lower to mid level budget. And those are typically the exception to the rule. So just the fact that this was able to be accomplished for $8 million and then go to the box office and make over $50 million, that's a really nice thing to see, especially coming after something like, Maximum Overdrive. As far as Stephen King adaptations go, some do much better than others, and I'm very glad that this is one of those ones that made back its budget and was definitely considered a success.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this one is definitely, top tier of Stephen King adaptations. And, it's like we see that, they're redoing, some of them, and like they redid, Pet Cemetery. And I think they're going to be redoing Salem's Lot. And, some of these, it's like you look back at and of course um, you know, I think some of these you look back at the adaptations and you can see, all right, like this was, it was fine for its time. But you can understand where, a modern day, a modern day update, could be beneficial for the movie, that they, especially, some of the ones with supernatural stuff, maybe they can do a little bit more. Now maybe they have a little bit bigger budget because a lot of the older adaptations were television adaptations. They were done as miniseries, and they
Mm-hmm.
weren't given these major budgets. But this is one that I hope they don't redo. I mean, I'm sure nothing's sacred, so
Yeah.
I don't see this one being high on anyone's list to redo, because rewatching it, it still holds up, and it has that timeless feel, and it does. I think it still has like all the strength that it needs. Whereas when I rewatched Pet Cemetery, the original, like I'm like, all right, yeah, like this is still, creepy and everything. But when they had announced the update, I was excited because I was like, this one could use an update. Like it's as terrifying as there are moments, in the original. It was dated and limited on some of the things that it could do. I mean, my thoughts on the new one is another topic, but but
A little
but
controversial for some Stephen King fans with that
yeah.
one.
But yeah, this one still continues to be top tier for me. I know Stephen King's not a huge fan of the Shining adaptation, but that's another one of my complete favorites.
Yeah, they remade that anyway later. So, even some of the
Yeah.
movies where I've thought they wouldn't need a remake, they've had them just because, people get bored and want to try something that already worked, I guess. I didn't
Hmm.
realize at first that there were as many Carrie movies as there are. So, I was like, but the original is so good. Why do we need any others? And
Carrie 2, The Rage.
yeah, and I have not watched that. I obviously is on my list to get to, but I'm not exactly
Isn't it?
looking forward to it because, to be Sissy Spacek is Carrie and I don't need another Carrie in my life.
Yeah. Supposedly, I have not rewatched Carrie to The Rage in many, many years. But so I read an article that supposedly the modern day, political climate apparently retroactively makes that movie better. So I'm interested to. It's like now I kind of want to go back and rewatch it, just to see what my thoughts are based on that article. But at the same time, I haven't been able to bring myself to rewatch it. And I never saw the. I'm a big fan of Chloe Grace Moretz. I might have that name wrong, but I have not seen the remake that she had done. I think that got mixed reactions. I'm not sure.
Yeah, when you have something that was stellar to begin with, it's sort of hard to follow that up with a remake. And we're
Yeah.
seeing certain things that, maybe didn't work for film that would work better for television now. The Dark Tower is getting a series, and
Mm-hmm.
I've heard nothing but horrible things about the movie. So,
Yeah.
it's one of those things where there are always Stephen King adaptations in the works. And
Oh yeah.
I think, just some final thoughts on Stand By Me here. If you listen to this and haven't watched it for some reason, definitely go do that. Sorry we spoiled it,
Sorry
but
about the spoilers.
the story
They
is
find a dead kid.
the story came out in like 1982, so you've had plenty of time to read or watch because the movie was also in the 80s. So, I think it's just one of those things where it's fun to spend time with those characters even if it isn't quite a happy ending.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. It's an absolutely beautiful film. The soundtrack's great, the cinematography's great, the acting's great, the direction's great. The pie eating contest is ridiculous and funny, even though it doesn't hold up as well. And the leeches scene still just as disgusting every time. I think if you're a fan of Stephen King, absolutely, this is a winner. And if you're a fan of just those great, classic,
Iconic.
yeah, sure. I'm very tired. It's just those the great iconic stories of just kids, the coming of age story. That's it.
There we
Coming of
go.
age story.
That's the
I knew I would
phrase.
get to it. Thank you for bearing with me, listeners, for the 50 minutes that it took me to come up with that. Yeah, if you're a fan of those, then you're gonna love this. And if you've watched it already, obviously you love it. Hopefully you love it. If you don't, I mean, don't at me. Um, but yeah, I can't recommend this movie more. I can't wait for the 4K adaptation to come out or not adaptation, whatever. Again,
The
tired.
4K version.
Yeah, I'm excited for that. I don't know what special features are on it, but I hope they have some new stuff. That would be cool. But yeah, I love this movie.
Yeah. Well, Tim, thank you so much for coming on to talk about it. It's definitely fun to rewatch this and just have a great discussion on it. And to our listeners, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Chat Sematary. You can rate and review the podcast wherever you want to do that. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, either one works for us. And as always, thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.